Well, yeah, I would like to say it's a delight to welcome Arash Abazari back to Johns Hopkins. Can't quite say that. I'll say it's very nice to welcome you, Arash, to Johns Hopkins hosted cyberspace for your talk. So Arash was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, finished his dissertation in 2017. Out of that dissertation came this amazing book, which is Hegel's Ontology of Power, the Structure of Social Domination in Capitalism. And Arash is an assistant professor of philosophy at Sharif University of Technology and a researcher at the Institute for Research in Fundamental Sciences, both of which are in Tehran, and has all sorts of other stuff going on and future projects that he's working on. And I'm very excited to welcome him. His talk is, or his presentation is based on the paper with the title, Reading the Philosophy of Right in Light of the Logic, Hegel on the Possibility of Multiple Modernities. All right, Arash.
So many thanks, Dean and Nick, for organizing this. And I'm extremely happy to have the occasion to present a paper for Terry Pinkard's Festschrift. I mean, he has been very influential worldwide, but in Iran is also, including Iran. His book on German Idealism has been translated and has been taught at the universities in Iran, and also his two books on the phenomenology of spirit and on the philosophy of history is being read and discussed in Iran. So apart from this, Terry Pinkard has helped me a lot in my dissertation, and also later, answering my emails about many different questions that I have about Hegel. So he has been always very helpful. So I'm very happy that I have an occasion to have a presentation in his honor. So because the papers, have been pre-circulated before, I don't want to present my entire paper. I just read through the introduction of my paper, but there's a handout coming with my talk. The entire argument is laid out in that handout for about 2 pages, so that you can look at it. It takes 2-3 minutes, and then you can look at it. So and it is Nick has posted it in the chat box. So this paper that I have written, it's entitled Reading the Philosophy of Right in Light of the Logic, Hegel on the Possibility of Multiple Modernities. And the reason I'm specifically interested in this kind of topic, because I'm, of course, a non-Western person, and I have always difficulty, or it's a challenge to be a Hegelian, but not a Western person. So this is a paper that just addresses my concerns. So broadly speaking, two views of modernity are prevalent in contemporary debates. The first dates back to 19th century, having been articulated by philosophers such as Hegel, according to popular interpretation of his work, and John Stuart Mill, and survives today in modernization theory and in the work of such thinkers as Francis Fukuyama. This view can be described in both economic and political terms. Economically, modern society is organized on the basis of the free market, as well as a set of regulations that guarantees the free exchange of commodities. Politically, it is organized on the basis of individual rights, the rule of law, a representative democracy based on an aggregation of individual interests, and formal contestation in the public sphere. According to this view, this is the only way of becoming modern, which is to say that modernity is tantamount to capitalist liberal democracy. The West has already achieved modernity, whereas most other areas of the world, like the so-called East, Third World, Global South, etc., have lagged behind. The other societies are, so to speak, still in the waiting room of a history. Their historical status is that of the not yet. They must wait to grow sufficiently mature to catch up with the West and eventually enter into history proper. If we allow that there's only one unique way of becoming modern, that the West has already and fully achieved modernity, and that societies outside the West have no option but to become modern in that unique way, then a justification for colonialism does not seem far off. At the same time, as hailing the principle of liberty as underpinning the modern society in the West, John Stuart Mill writes unabashedly that for those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered in its nonage, liberty is of no use. Rather, quote, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, unquote. In the considerations on representative government, he goes so far as to claim that since in those barbarous or semi-barbarous societies of India or Africa, a good despot is a rare and transitory accident, it is necessary for colonizers to install and reinforce a despotic state. The colonial state is immune to the precariousness of tenure attendant on barbarous despotisms and can help the barbarous nations to gradually mature into modernity. Such, he concludes, as a quote of him, is the ideal rule of a free people over a barbarous or semi-barbarous one, unquote. In other words, for Mill, the authoritarian colonial state is the handmaid of historical progress and instigates or facilitates the transition into modernity. It was exactly in reaction to this monolithic colonialist conception of modernity that postcolonial theory gradually emerged in the 1980s, subsequently since 1990s, acquiring a respectable position worldwide via the influence of Western academia. According to postcolonial theory, there is genuinely no such thing as modernity. There's no genuinely such thing as modernity. What the West erroneously calls modernity is nothing but a highly parochial way of thought and of economic and political organization that developed by accident first in the West and then by the exercise of military violence or economic power was subsequently universalized. Thus, there is no universal history or universal philosophy or universal social theory. There is only the parochial history of Europe, the parochial philosophy of Europe, the parochial social theory of Europe, which are being sold as universal history, as universal philosophy, as universal social theory. Some go so far as to claim that even the hard sciences, such as physics, are inflected by the place in which they arose and the social relations therein, and thus universal validity, and thus that universal validity cannot be claimed for their contents. The hallmark of post-colonial theory is the stress on the difference or incommensurability between the so-called East and the West. The social reality in the East is so fundamentally different than, hence incommensurate with that of the West, that to analyze the East, one cannot use the categories of the social sciences developed in the West. Even the very structure of agency in people in the East is posited as fundamentally different than and thus incommensurate with that of the people in the West. While the former are motivated primarily through concerns for religion and community, the post-colonial theorists say that this kind of thing. The latter are primarily motivated by self-interest and the pursuit of monetary gain. Post-colonial theory thus emphasizes the role of culture in lieu of politics and economy, and even seeks to reinterpret politics and economy in cultural terms. Post-colonial theory has secured some tenure jobs in certain respectable universities of the West, usually for the people with ethnic roots in the East, and yet it is regressive. Post-colonial theory is exactly the mirror image of the 19th century racism of such philosophers as Mill. While Mill thinks that democratic rule is only suitable for Western societies and leads to disaster if used by barbarous nations, post-colonial theory posits that the ideas of self-determination and autonomy first historically developed in the West remain only a Western construct and are not suitable for the radically heterogeneous societies of the East. By doing so, and especially because it has acquired an aura of respectability from Western academia, post-colonial theory actually feeds into the machinery of authoritarian states in non-Western societies. It is being claimed that while self-determination and democratic self-determination democratic collective determination may be good for the West, it is not suitable for us, since we have a different culture, religion, sensibility, whatever from them. Rejecting both modernization theory and post-colonial theory, I want to suggest in this paper that there is a third way of understanding modernity, but one that is also inspired by Hegel's philosophy. Contrary to modernization theory, this third Hegelian way respects difference, while at the same time, contrary to post-colonial theory, does not engage in dividing the human species into fundamentally different or incommensurate groups. This third way, that is, lauds modernity as the universal achievement of humankind, while at the same time does not offer a rigid Eurocentric definition of it. Of course, Hegel occasionally writes or talks in a way that suggests he believes in some version of modernization or even colonialist theory. But I argue, if we read Hegel's work on the basis of the reasoning that it offers, rather than on the basis of the occasional chauvinistic claims that he makes, we realize that Hegel indeed provides a third conception of modernity, one that is committed to the legitimacy of modernity, but nonetheless can conceive of modernity in multiple ways. In order to do this, I suggest that we need to turn to Hegel's institutional account of modernity in the philosophy of right, but with an important proviso. Importantly, namely, rather than reading the philosophy of right on its own, as it is occasionally done in the literature on it, we must read the philosophy of right in light of the most general normative principles that ground Hegel's justification of modern institutions, normative principles that are sufficiently expounded only in the logic of the concept of the science of logic. Thus, I argue that Hegel's theory of modernity is to be found at the conjunction of the philosophy of right and the science of logic. Neglecting the logic of the concept while attending only to the philosophy of right may and indeed will result in reifying Hegel's institutional account of modernity into an inflexible blueprint and collapses Hegel's distinct theory of modernity into a version of modernization theory. Conversely, neglecting the philosophy of right while attending only to fleshing out the normative principles of the logic of the concept will deprive Hegel's theory of modernity of its empirical historical underpinnings and water it down to a predominantly normative social theory reminiscent that of John Rawls and hence susceptible to the same deficiencies. Moreover, I will argue that Hegel's philosophy of right helps us to conceive of modernity primarily in terms of the political and economic organization of society, leaving aside the cultural, religious, traditional, and communitarian elements of society, which are not germane to and usually obscure a theory of modernity. Thank you. So I intentionally kept it brief so that we have more time for Q&A. Many thanks.
Great. Thank you, Arash. So yeah, the handout is in the chat if anybody is still looking for it.
As I said, I mean, the argument of the whole paper is presented in the handout. So if you look through it, you would find it.
Maybe I can just ask one question before, just to get us started. And that is just about what exactly the appeal to the logic is doing in your account, Arash. I mean, there's typically been a distinction in the literature between the method and the content. Is it the method, do you think, in your view, dialectical method, the negative method, that's what we should take from the logic? I didn't get really that sense. I wonder if you just say a couple more words about what it is that we take from the logic.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that is, the logic can be used in different ways. Yes, of course, Hegel stresses that it is about, that provides the dialectical methodology, for the philosophy of right. But that was like a different route. I didn't take in this paper, but that is equally legitimate. I just specifically focused on the logic of the concept because And I felt that it provides a kind of normative foundations for modernity, and that normative foundations is also historical. It's not a kind of I know that like now people tend to read Hegel more in the logic more in like in a priori manner, but I prefer to read it in like in historical way. So that is actually the horizon of intelligibility of modern people, and that is the logic of concept where like the explanation stops. It's like it's kind of without the logic of the concept, you will the chain of explanation is not ended. One needs like the logic of the concept so that it like provides full account of modernity. Thanks, Dan.
Well, let me go to Jay Bernstein and then I'll get to Mohammed Borhani. So Jay Bernstein.
Great. So Arash, thank you for that paper and the presentation. As you may be aware already, I think you and I and Paul Redding have written the same paper, but from very different angles, which is the excitement, in that each of us are interested in, beyond the institutional structure of the philosophy of right, we're interested in the logic of the syllogism, in the notions of singularity, particularity, and universality. And I take it that you translate that, right, into three forms of self-determination. That's how you get, I take it, that's what you mean by the meta-norms of modernity. That is, we're looking at individual self-determination, group self-determination, and collective self-determination as the great achievement of modernity. And that is a way of thinking about and past the institutional structure of the philosophy of right. So I think that's, if I'm summarizing the argument, I hope that's it.
Yes.
So the question runs, I am deeply sympathetic with that thought, and I'm equally sympathetic that the intelligibility of the syllogism depends on that ethical content, right? That's part of the theory, that you can't separate the two levels. The question is really about your argument concerning politics and economics. Because the difficulty is that while the critique of capitalism will come up in nearly every paper over the next 3 days, the question is, how can we think meaningfully about the autonomy of economy from politics in a relevant way, that is, avoiding mere state control and not run into all the problems of capital. That is, it seems to me, on the one hand, your movement to the logic opens a space, which I agree with, right? I think that's how you get multiple modernities. The question is, how do you multiply them in actuality?
So many thanks. Yes, exactly. Because I mean, I like the philosophy of right book, but actually I think it is a failure. I mean, I as a whole, it's a failure. It's just like the institutional structure of capitalism doesn't support freedom. And I just, let me be completely explicit about it, that I don't think that structure works in reality. So one way is just, I felt that maybe perhaps one can like read the logic so that it has a kind of liberatory effect on the philosophy of right, so that I mean, perhaps one can do something about it, but I'm not sure whether it is possible eventually. So I have said that it might provide a solution to Hegel's theory in philosophy of right. But I think that there's something about the philosophy of right that is important. One is because if you look at the table of content, and I have emphasized in the paper, there is no account of culture and religion. It's about economics and politics. I mean, the modern problematic is about economy and politics. And I mean, like Hegel was completely materialist, like Marx, like Marx says it. It's just, the question is like whether it is, whether like, it's not about ethnic traditions. Modernity is not about that kind of thing. It's only about politics and economy and how to relation between the two. So when I say multiple modernities, and I think that it's not about like that, I think that there's like, for example, Iranian way of modernity, that kind of thing I don't believe, I mean, or Buddhist concept of modernity. But I think that there can be like a kind of social arrangements that allows for modernity. I mean, like while remaining in the structure of Hegelian structure. Of course, one could be like Marxist and say, no, this structure doesn't work at all. But if one wants to remain in the Hegelian structure, so that provides some room for market, I think that Hegel would be somebody like a market socialist one. I mean, like a kind of arrangement that in which there is market for transmission of information for the price of commodities, but there is no market for like capital. There is no market for labor. There is no capital and there is no market for labor. And then, like, for example, perhaps G.A. Cohen's Why Not Socialism, that kind of stuff. And that kind of institutional arrangement, which is still about economics and politics, I think perhaps it would be a solution to the like capitalist world that we live in. But in the current, I don't think that. I think that Marx in this account is right. I mean, Hegel's account of a state cannot regulate cannot regulate the economy. I think it's also history has testified to it. Thanks.
Let me go to Mohammed Burhani.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the 3 layers of historical temporality, since the passage read from the paper wasn't about that. I don't know if it's okay that I go on asking about it.
Yes, please.
Well, it is said in the paper that in order to understand singular events, there needs to be a structure of repetition. Like in the case of the letter which informs of the death of someone, which needs an institutional network, or in the case of an utterance, though new, needs other things like words that are pre-existing. Now, if we were thinking only about these 2 layers, I think it would be pretty understandable why the first isn't possible without the other. But as has been mentioned in the paper, neither of these 2, or even both of them combined, can hold themselves. And also this and the necessity of the 3rd layer is quite understandable. I mean, if we consider it like that, then the necessity of the 3rd one, I think it's quite understandable. But my question is that if we are going to bring in the 3rd layer anyways, I don't get the necessity of the 2nd one. If we have the logical aspect, why can't we consider all other unique events in their singularity and use them as minute memories to go on, I don't know, confronting the worlds or trying to understand things? I can think about a multiplicity of things which have no relation with each other in my society in general, but I make them related to each other in my personal experience. You know, a priori, they don't have a relation to each other. They are not institutionalized in a relation with each other, but I may do that, and I can do that. And though others in my society may not understand why I put them in the same bag, but in doing so, I use the logic that is understandable to them. I can explain to them why I did that, and then they will understand why I did that. I think.
So I got your point. If you want to continue, please. But I don't.
What brings this for me is another question. That do we not do the same while we are conceiving of the institutions? I mean, they can even be conceived as unique things, as events. Like, I don't think that this will rule out the significance of modern institutions or Hegel's project to justify them. I'm just saying that as each unique event is in fact consisted of parts, the letter itself is constituted by a multiplicity of sentences, words, etc. The institutions themselves can be understood in terms of a unique phenomena, and if we do not assume that events or things which have no temporal duration, we can conceive of institutions as events. I don't know if this makes sense
Okay, thanks.
or not.
I got your point. Thanks. So I mean, you are asking, basically your question is why there is such a thing as objective guides. I mean, for Hegel, you can't have any kind of freedom. You cannot even talk. I mean, how can, like, the language is a kind of like institution that is like intersubjectively constituted. It's not only open to me. It is, otherwise I cannot express myself. So the point is, I think that is like one feature. If like it is like really Hegel is just that it is kind of, he has an account of objective guides that is not reducible to subjective like instances of like people doing different things. Like even when we are talking with each other, we are assuming that the meaning of the words and their content is relatively fixed. Otherwise, how can we communicate? So I think that it's like somehow obvious from Hegelian's point of view that like there needs to be the second the second step. Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks.
Let's go to Chris Yeomans.
Sure, I'll try and be short. So I'm also really interested in this, and particularly bringing in Reinhard Koselleck and these sorts of conceptions of historicity. In a way, I guess I wanted to pull you in the opposite direction that Jay Bernstein wanted to pull you, and towards, as it were, the singular events. Because in a way, and maybe this is a way of responding to Mohammed's question as well, in that, so to back up, one of the things that I thought was sort of strange about your use of Koselleck is you wanted to use Koselleck's taxonomy to sort of separate these things in Hegel. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that all the energy in Koselleck is in figuring out how these things are tied together and how they're pulling on each other and how they're in tension with each other, right? And so it strikes me that part of what's valuable about the philosophy of right, precisely for a project like yours of alternate modernities, is seeing the distinctive historical moment in which it intervenes, which is precisely a moment in which all the options are on the table, right? In which the thing that has been known, the Holy Roman Empire, is decidedly off the table, and what things are going to look like now is anybody's guess, right? And it could go all the way from the Austrian model to the French model if we wanted to run the continuum that way, right? And so there's a kind of continuum of historical possibilities there, and within that continuum, you can see Hegel trying to solve these problems, some of which you've laid out here in terms of individual, group, and collective self-determination. And just a plug that it strikes me that it's valuable to see Hegel working in a kind of problem-solving mode, in a kind of institutional design mode, if you want to pick up on how these, as you term them, meta-norms might be involved. Right, and that gives you a kind of value to the individual specificity there. So that was just a pull. And then just one quick question, which is, in a way, I'm very sympathetic to your notion of the irrelevance of culture, tradition, ethnic ethos, and religion. Definitely culture and ethos, but tradition and religion, it strikes me as less clear. Right, in part, it strikes me that the whole point of having a lower house of the legislature that is populated by the agricultural estate is that you get this inertial tie to history that keeps the civil social estate from launching you into the future, right? That sort of holds you in this reformist present. So that's one question about whether really tradition can be entirely excised from Hegel's account. And the second is just the basic, I mean, he seems to think this is a Lutheran thing, right? This is not going to happen in Catholic countries, right? That there's something, even though it's in one sense secular, because lots of different religious groups can attain self-determination. It's only Lutheranism that allows them to do that, right? So I just ask what you think about the continuing relevance of tradition and religion.
Okay, thank you. Great question, Chris. Thank you very much. Thank you. So about your first point, I agree with you. I mean, like one thing that I always try to do when I want to understand Hegel is somehow de-dialectize Hegel. I mean, because it is like everything is dialectical, they are all interwoven. So I try to have some kind of analytic framework so that I can understand what he's doing. But your point is granted. Yes, Hegel tries to bring all these together. But about the singular events, that's not the place in the philosophy of right. I mean, and that's the reason that I don't like the book. I mean, the event was on the philosophy of right, but I wish it was on the phenomenology of the spirit. I think that it has much more like resources to understand exactly the individual action, individual events. But philosophy of right is a kind of institutional account, and I don't think that there's any room for it for any kind of singularity or individuality. Unless you disagree with me, I don't know. But so I think, yes, so I agree with you that there is a room for events, like singular events, but that the place is not in the philosophy of right. The project is different. About the culture and religion, I was never convinced that this is the result of Protestantism, and I was never convinced. And there's like a similar debate like about between Carl Lewis and who is this guy? Yes, the legitimacy of modern age. There's Blumenberg, and in that debate I also take side with Blumenberg. I don't think that modernity is the result of Christianity. It's a different force, and then Christianity had to somehow adapt itself to the modern force. And so I don't buy that particular strand of Hegel's argument. And I don't know, I mean, like French Revolution was not in a Protestant country. I think, I don't know. I mean, like Protestantism has only, like capitalism. You can link Protestantism with capitalism, but I don't think that it can take credit for like all modernity and whatever. About religion, I don't think, and even when Hegel talks about Christianity, the way that he talks about it, it's not actually, it doesn't have any doctrinal content. It's just about that you respect individuality, individual freedom, and that provides a kind of substance of social life. But I don't think that why a substance of social life must be necessarily provided by religion. So I don't take that part of Hegel's argument. Yes, but there's your other point about traditions. That is true, but I think that is the part of Hegel's work that is wrong. I mean, and I disagree with your work, because really that kind of thing that yes, my point is there is some kind of perhaps ethos in economic organization of society. Like people have different professions, they have different ethos. But one shouldn't push that so far. I don't think that like this, like agricultural state, I don't think this agribusiness people, I don't think that there's in any sense conservative, like that they want to save, perhaps they're conservative in political sense, but not. So I don't think that that way of like the differentiation of Hegel into states is correct. I don't think, yes, there is some kind of ethos, but that ethos comes through like perhaps trade unions and that kind of thing. And I don't think that it should enter into the political process. At the formal level, it shouldn't, you can define modernity without any specific culture of any specific group of these people. Thanks, Chris, thanks. I don't know whether you are convinced, but.
Let's go to Robert Pippin and then we'll get to Morteza Fakarian. Robert.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the paper. I want to go back to your general point about the relation between the logic and the philosophy of right. I think you'd agree that that question depends on a general position on the relation between the logic and the encyclopedia. So one question is, given the way you set this up with the meta-norm and then norm distinction, you seem to push the question back to something like the status of the meta-norms and why we should think of them as in some way constitutive or unavoidable or right in a way that isn't answered in the way the question about the normative structure of a political state would be appealed to in that structure. So that's one dimension of the claim. The other is your very interesting point about reading the logic historically. If going back to the issue of the relation between the logic and the encyclopedia, if it's true that the logic is incomplete without the encyclopedia, which I think is Hegel's position, the Entlassen at the end of the logic makes clear that he doesn't think the enterprise of the logic is coherent without its actualization in the real philosophy. And given the fact that the end of the philosophy of spirit is a return to the logic, that the whole structure is circular, if the logic is the expression or the articulation of the intelligibility of the current, let's say, to make this simple, the current natural sciences and the current historical developments of spirit, that these are the forms of thought without which that form of life cannot be understood, and that form of life is historical, it would mean that the forms of intelligibility, your notion of meta-norms, would also have to change in the further developments of the history of science and spirit. And the question for you is, wouldn't that make the general task of Hegelian philosophy hermeneutic rather than logic in the philosophical sense? In other words, there's no real conception of absolute necessity in this project of reading the logic history. I have no objection to that. I mean, it might be the way, I mean, no reason to raise it now as a question, but it does seem to me an implication of your position that the fundamental task of Hegelian philosophy is a hermeneutic exfoliation of the forms of thought without which our form of life would not be intelligible to us at the highest level, and including the singularity, particularity, universality relationship. But that would be something that would be subject to developments in the domain of Wirklichkeit that require a rethinking of that without which we could not make intelligible to ourselves the way we're living. Okay. Is that an implication you accept?
Thank you. Now, I wouldn't say that it goes so far that I would say it's a hermeneutics, but it's between something hermeneutics and logic, not exactly like logic and not exactly. There's interpretive elements in Hegel. I think that one cannot deny that. But I mean, perhaps I'm a little bit distancing from the text because I think that like the historical justification that why there are these three norms and no, not any other, I think that is provided in the phenomenology of spirit. So he gives there like a different dialectic between individuality, particularity, universality, and they all fail. And then eventually the norms of modernity come out to be the case. But about the historicity of the logic, I mean, and actually I have read also your new book, right? In this point, I don't like it. I mean, it's a great book, but in this point because you seem to push towards that it is not even historical, like logic is not historical and it's like purely a priori. At least this was my understanding of your book. So I would answer a kind of, like, for example, a kind of Marxian way of answering this question. And that is, so for Marx, there's a distinction. So for Marx says that, for example, in Capital, he says that we have a category of labor in general, but at the same time, labor in general, which is transhistorical and historically invariant, but it's not explanatory. You cannot explain anything. You cannot explain capitalism on the basis of the concept of labor in general. And that's the same point for me with Hegel. I don't think that the logic, I mean, of course, one can, at a very high level of abstraction, one can talk about that. He talks about contingency and necessity and appearance and essence. And that kind of things should be, like perhaps they are historically invariant. But I don't think that the specific content, like how Hegel understands necessity, how Hegel understands contingency, how Hegel understands essence, how Hegel understands appearance, that is historical. And I think that otherwise it loses its explanatory power. I mean, if it becomes too general, then it loses its explanatory power about actually existing societies.
Yeah,
Okay.
I appreciate that point, but just a brief intervention. Even in Marx, labor is no longer labor when it's freed from the sphere of necessity. It's something else. It isn't invariant. I mean,
yes.
After the revolution, labor, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, read at night. There's no labor. The idea is a liberation from necessity, not another form of necessity. So it would make the same point in a different way when you raise the question of Marx. And the question, there is some invariancy in Marx. There has to be, because it's supposed to be, wissenschaftlich, but it's not labor, is it?
I mean,
we want to get rid of labor.
There is a chapter, he talks about labor in general, and he says, he gives that famous examples of bees and the spiders. And he thinks that labor is like essentially a teleological activity. And at that level of generality, I mean, there's something to labor. That is not historical. Labor is a teleological activity aiming to satisfy some certain needs, and that is somehow, but then he immediately adds that this is not helpful at all for understanding capitalism. You cannot, because capitalism, there's this kind of notion of abstract labor, which is mediated through exchange of commodities and like mechanization of work, and that is a different category. But I take it, I mean, there's this debate in Marx as well. People say that whether there's he's completely historicist, or whether there's a kind of like historically invariant ingredient to it.
Well, we should maybe,
okay.
Yeah, thank you, Arash. And we've got 6 hands and about 15 minutes, a little bit more maybe, so we can try to keep our questions short. Morteza Farkawian, I've got that right.
Thank you very much, Arash, for your interesting talk. Nice to see you here. I have a question regarding your take on religion, a little similar to the question of Christopher Yeomans, but from a different point of view. If you see the religion from the standpoint of the absolute guys, then the religion is not simply something like a special kind of belief, some ritual activities, etc., but a figure of the absolute Geist. So my question, if religion plays such a minor role, how would you fill its place, or which institution could replace it as absolute Geist with its characteristic functions, like the source of conscience, the source of trust, and so on. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks. So I am not like strictly Hegelian. I'm not like follower of Hegel in all the points that he says. I don't think that religion has that kind of like social solidarity or social cohesion right now. And if there is something about absolute Geist, that is about art, I think. I mean, I think that Hegel was wrong to think that religion is higher than art. No, like if there's some kind of reflection about our common practices in institutional settings, that is the work of the art nowadays. I don't think, and that has some, that can be defended, I think, but not necessarily his account of like reconciliation in religion. So I see your point. I mean, he says such things. He says such things, but I think he's wrong. I think. Thanks.
All right, Viren Murthy.
Yes, thank you very much, Arash Abazari, for this talk. I share a lot of interests with you in terms of thinking about Hegel in relation to non-Western societies and so on. And I have, well, one comment and then a question. So the first, let me begin with a suggestion. So the suggestion has to do with your treatment of postcolonialism at the very beginning. I think that that part I would suggest sort of giving us a little more detail there, because you make a lot of statements such as postcolonialism is like just the inversion of 19th century racism or something like that. I think that would need to be backed up a little bit just for your readers. But I don't want to get into that because that's a topic that goes beyond this conference. But one thing there I think should be noted, and I think that when you talk about reading sort of Hegel as a proponent of multiple modernity, the idea of multiple modernity or alternative modernity is often proposed by a lot of the postcolonialists. But that then brings me to my question. And the question really echoes a lot of what has already been said. And it has to do with how you actually understand modernity, right? Because I think what you're really getting at is a very important question. Is okay, if you're interested in countries in the non-West and so on, how should they deal with Hegel? How should they appropriate the insights of Hegel? And I see here, and here's my question is really, I see here sort of two possibilities, and I sort of wanted to see where you're going. So one is that when we think about the non-West in relation to the West, and you brought this as well, I mean, is we often think of this problem of colonialism, imperialism, and so on. And so I was wondering how you think about, say, the anti-colonial nationalist movements, right? I think that would be one of the things that come in, because it seemed like imperialism wasn't part of your analysis, even though you could say that the whole Hegelian emphasis on freedom and so on, and his discussion of slavery, all of that could support a whole anti-imperialist idea. I mean, and here you could have Fanon and so on, right? I mean, and I think the second part of this, again, connected to Fanon and so on, is something that's come up already in almost all the questions, and I think it's central to your work, and that is the problem of capitalism, right? Because that it seems like, and I haven't read your book, and I'm looking forward to looking at it, is that you seem to develop a reading of Hegel that goes against capitalism, right? That in some way, you know, using Marx or whatever. And I think, and here, of course, I'm sort of going out on a limb because I haven't actually read your work, but that seems to be like a universal goal that has to do with our world historical moment and so on. But I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, yes, I mean, that is like a project of, yes, because this post-colonial theory, like it has some force, and I think it's important to criticize it. Yeah, but this was not the place. I mean, it took a lot of space. And one problem with post-colonial theory in general is just the way that they write. I mean, it's like either they are like influenced by Derrida, I don't know. It's just difficult to pin down exactly what they are saying. And they're just like writing in very convoluted ways. And and whatever you say that this is their position, they say, no, we say other things. And like when Vivek Chiber, is like a sociologist at the NYU, wrote his book, and it's an excellent book, Against Post-Colonial Theory, there was a debate ensuing, and all like Chakrabarti, they came in and said, no, we didn't say this, but they exactly say the same thing. I think there's one word about post-colonialism, and that is incommensurability. I mean, that word, I think, captures the gist of what they are saying, that like people in the East are incommensurable with the West. I just don't believe that. I mean, like empirically, I think it's completely false. I mean, like for example, if you see, I don't know, perhaps the best like religious films that ever made are by like Carl Theodor Dreyer and like Bresson, or that are Western, they are not Eastern. I mean, I don't think that like the Eastern countries have, I don't think that there's any difference, but and then the way that they talk about multiple modernities, it's not the way that I talk about it. I mean, and there's also this guy Eisenstadt that has written a lot about multiple modernities, but he thinks about it in cultural terms, and post-colonialism thinks about it in cultural terms. I don't think that's the right way to go. It's about economy and politics, how to organize economy, how to organize politics. And and all your examples that you gave, yes, anti-colonialist nationalism, all of them, if you see, I don't know, like Fanon, if you see Che Guevara, anyone, I mean, all of them were about self-determination. I don't think that it's a so-called Western value. It's about self-determination. It's not about culture, ethnicity. It's about national liberation movement. Is about self-determination, autonomy in a broad sense of the word. And I think that Hegel might provide some ways, because I think that there's some kind of and non-Western countries can provide some way, because there's some kind of self-complacency in Western world. I mean, I would say, I'm sorry to say, I mean, it's a kind of like indifference that we have. But if you come, for example, into the Middle East, there's so much energy here. It's not like, it's just pent up energy. I'm not saying that it goes necessarily in a good way or bad. It might go in a wrong way, but at least there's this kind of energy, which is completely absent in the West. At least in my experience, I didn't have that experience. So I think that non-Western countries can provide a solution about the relation of the economy and politics in the way that the Western countries cannot, because of their like self-complacency. But that has nothing to do with culture or that kind of thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Arash. I would like to get Jean-Francois Quevet, my French accent is terrible, Quevegan into the discussion. Jean-Francois?
Yes. You heard me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your very interesting paper. I think, like you, that the use of Koselleck's concepts in order to interpret Hegel's text, in particular, of course, philosophy of history, can be very fruitful. But I have a disagreement with you about the question of religion. Personally, I share your distrust of the churches, but I am not sure that this is also the case for Hegel. Moreover, we must distinguish between religion and the churches. Religion is a matter of absolute spirit, but the churches are social institutions which, as such, participate in the formation of the political disposition. And in this respect, I think you misunderstand the meaning of paragraph 268, page 16 of your paper, when Hegel writes that the political disposition is the consequence of the institutions within the state. For me, he is not thinking of the political institutions, but of the social institutions, corporations, etc., the only ones that have been mentioned so far. And of course, the churches are such social institutions. Thanks.
Okay, many thanks. I mean, the way that I see the role of religion in the philosophy of rights. So he sees the forces of market capitalism disrupting the fabric of society, and he doesn't have any solution to it. And so he just brings in religion into it so that it solves the problem. And I don't think that this way it solves the problem. He needs something that provides some kind of social solidarity. But I don't think that, perhaps one could go the way that, for example, Durkheim went. I mean, that is, he talks about, even if he talks about religion, it's a religion of the individual, that kind of thing. He wants to, and he was concerned there about like social solidarity all his life, from the beginning to the end of his life. He was concerned about social solidarity. But Hegel just, I think that he somehow cheats. He sees the problem that there is a market forces of capitalism that disrupts the fabric of society. And as a kind of deus ex machina, he wants to bring in religion. And I don't think that, I don't think that the institution of church, it's important that civil society for Hegel is organized around labor arrangements. It's economic organization. It's not when he talks, it's different states, different, but the main, at least but the main structure of the book is about like the states with E, the states, different economic organizations, and that is the trade unions and social organizations on the base, but not the church. I'm saying, church is not, it's not any kind of civil association. It's only civil associations that are grounded on the economy that he is mainly concerned with. I'm sorry.
Okay, I don't agree, but okay.
Okay, thanks.
Probably not going to settle that question today. Thank you. I think Mark McCoy put his question in the chat to me, so I'm going to pass that on. We'll just take Anton Kubeshkin's question and then wrap things up.
Thank you. Thanks, Arash, for your talk. Really interesting and good to see you as well. I just have a bit of a follow-up on your exchange with Robert Pippin. So you said that you can acknowledge that at a certain level, the science of logic deals with very abstract categories, and to that extent, it can be considered as a priori, but then it's not explanatory of modernity or social institutions and that thing. But I wonder if you can acknowledge the first point, like that whether it cannot be considered as sort of indirectly relevant for explanation of those institutions, in that it works through the more abstract layer of the concepts and their interrelationship, which in turn will be relevant once we get to the more concrete concepts, which we use explanation of social or also natural and psychological and so on concepts. So yeah, there would be several layers. At one layer where we proceed somehow a priori, although what exactly that means is a question. We establish the interrelationship, sort of the network of relations with these abstract concepts, how exactly they involve or refer to each other. And that has some relevance, although not direct for explanation of, for example, social institutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. Good to see you. Thank you very much. I mean, Hegel, there is evidence in the text. I mean, in the second introduction to the science of logic, he explicitly relates the logic to the grammar of the language. I mean, grammar is, and he talks about, he says that the logic is the expression of Geist as a language. And that is, I think it's very revealing. Grammar is not like a priori, like completely a priori. It is inside the language, it's always embodied in the language, and the language changes and the grammar will also change. I mean, I think that it would be, if we accept that it is like, for example, so it is, I wouldn't say in answer to Robert Pippin and you, I wouldn't say this is exactly hermeneutics. It's like perhaps like kind of Aristotelian way of thinking. So you have a phenomenon, then you try to understand the phenomenon, then you reach the more like general, like some kind of logical categories to understand the phenomenon. It's not, one couldn't say that it is only hermeneutic. It's like, but it is both ways. It is, you start with the phenomenon, you develop a kind of conceptual apparatus. Then you, with your conceptual apparatus, you go back to the phenomenon to understand what is the case. So I think even if we understand Hegel as completely a priori, I think like Marx's criticism is exactly correct. It is two reasons. One, it's just constraining of our theoretical activity. So we have set out some kind of logical categories. So whatever phenomenon we want to understand, we just try to fit into those categories. I think that's not the way to do any kind of empirical inquiry. And moreover, it somehow distorts empirical inquiry because you have like prefixed some kind. So the relation can't be like one way from logic to the relation to the real philosophy. The relation must be two ways. I don't.
I would like to wrap this up, but Bob Stern, could you make it short, maybe?
I mean, only if there's time, but I just wanted to chuck in on the religion question, whether Arash thinks, I mean, on the one hand, you want to say there are a lot of problems with the philosophy of right. On the other hand, Hegel goes beyond the philosophy of right in the structure of the Encyclopedia to chapters that include religion. So one thought might be, well, it's precisely there that some of the problems of the philosophy of right get solved. They're not all soluble in the terms of a political project. But that, of course, would make the religion more central rather than less. So I imagine you sort of wouldn't like that, but arguably that's the structure of the way the Encyclopedia is built, right? And so it's precisely by, I mean, in a way, Hegel himself leaves religion out of the philosophy of right, but he does it thinking, well, yeah, and then there are going to be problems in the philosophy of right that I'm going to need to move to religion in a different form, as it were, or a different mode to solve. And you just forget about, you know, you're not interested in that. But is that fair to Hegel in a way?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks. But the religion that he talks is only about forgiveness, like it's Christian religion of forgiveness. That's the end of the phenomenology of the spirit, chapter of the phenomenology of the spirit.
No, I'm thinking of the Encyclopedia structure.
Yeah, but I don't think that the religion that solves the problem is the problem of it's Christian religion that is characterized as forgiveness. I mean, and forgiveness, you come to Islamic countries, is the same forgiveness as in the, and Christian countries is the same in like Buddhist countries. I don't think that out of forgiveness, you get this very thick notion of religion. I don't know. And that solves the problem of objective guides, the relation of forgiveness. That is okay.
Yeah. We'll be hearing Yeah, we'll be hearing more about that question this afternoon, as Jay Bernstein said. All right, well, thank you very much, Arash. This was wonderful. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.